want to welcome all of you for being with us tonight. I'm Elaine Sanders, the Adult Programming Coordinator for the Mark Twain Library. And we are so thrilled to have you here tonight. There are two audiences, our in-house audience at the library and those of you who are at Zoom. So thank you for being here. We just are so happy to have you join us for this fabulous two-part series, delving into the history of the Merritt Parkway. Tonight, Wes Haynes, Executive Director of the Merritt Parkway Conservancy, will take us on a tour of the historic public libraries along the Merritt. And then he'll be back with us again on Wednesday, March 30th, to talk about the Parkway's historic bridges. So I hope you'll join us for that one too. Wes has been with the Merritt Parkway Conservancy since 2018, and he grew up driving the Merritt. He is a Stanford resident with a 40-year career in architectural preservation, including teaching it at the Parsons School of Design in New York, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, and the Brooklyn High School for the Arts. So before I turn the evening over to Wes, I would like to thank our in-person audience for following the library's policy that masks are required during programs. Our mask policy is constantly changing and reevaluated, and hopefully there'll be more changes coming. We are just thrilled to see you here in person. So for those of you on Zoom, you are a vital member of the audience, and we do want to hear from you. So please feel free to type your questions into the questions and comments into the Q&A function at any time, and that's at the bottom of your screen in the menu bar down below. So we'd like to hear from you. We are recording tonight's program, so you can look for it in about a week on the library's YouTube channel. And if your friends and family could not join us tonight, it will be there for them to watch also. So now I'd like to turn things over to Wes. Thank you, Wes. It's a privilege to have you at the Mark Twain Library.
The Merritt Parkway Conservancy is, let me tell you a little bit about that first. We're a nonprofit organization. We were formed 20 years ago. This is our 20th birthday this year. To steward the Parkway and to also be the sentinel against really bad development along the Parkway and also the expenditure of public money on the Parkway. Parkways, not all roads get the same level of treatment, and the reason why the Merritt Parkway looks the way it does is that it's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. All federal money has to go towards its restoration and in safety and transportation improvements, but it has to be restorative in nature. And during COVID, we came up with this idea that we might use the Parkway as a kind of a trail to go through and visit some other places that are on the National Register or would be eligible to be put on the National Register. The Parkway is considered the last example of the Beaux-Arts City Beautiful movement in the United States that gave us so many beautiful downtowns and so many wonderful buildings. And certainly among that period, the public libraries stand out. They are among the most beautiful buildings that were built in America from the mid-19th century to the present day. So because nobody was traveling during COVID, we thought that we could do virtual tours of Fairfield County, take you to ancient Rome, take you to ancient America, to look at some of the really great buildings that we have out there. The Parkway was very sensitively sited when it was built to avoid demolition of existing buildings. It wasn't like I-95 at all, which was just torn through existing cities down along the coast. The Parkway was intentionally located 6 miles north of the shoreline so that it was outside of the area of heavily developed areas. It crosses lands that had never been crossed by a road before, that weren't really possible to ascend and descend the hills before the internal combustion engine. And it was really meant to relieve traffic along the post road and to direct cars to take pleasure rides in the northern part, the prettiest part of Fairfield County. And the Parkway, when I talk about the Parkway, it's the stretch of our Parkway system that starts at the New York border and ends at the Housatonic River, 39.5 miles. So it's entirely within Fairfield County. So we're going to take a quick drive-by a number of places, and I'll orient us by the exits on the Parkway. Oh, okay, great. Okay, there we are. So we have we're going to look at primarily at buildings that were intentionally, purposely built as public libraries. And I'm going to sort of go through them chronologically, not geographically, but we will start with not necessarily the first library in here, but we'll start in the room, in the building we're in right now. The Mark Twain Library was originally a memorial library. Mark Twain basically gave this library over to a new library that was formed in memory of his daughter, who died quite unexpectedly. And this was a house he had built for her. And when she passed away, Twain felt that Reading could use a library, and decided to start the ball rolling. And it's pretty typical of most of the libraries that were built. The public library kind of emerged in the 1840s as an institution, first housed in church basements, and then in appropriated buildings that may have been built for other purposes. And this is a great example of one of those buildings that was built for another purpose, but adapted as a library. And this is what, I don't know why such a stretch building on the left, something went fluky with the image, but this is what this room that we're in right now looked like originally, as it did when the library first opened. So it's not really that different than it looks today, except there's new cases around the room and different furniture. And libraries were places where books were stored and available for more than one person to use. We had a long tradition of private libraries in this country, but public libraries kind of emerged as a way of collective sharing of books. Another example of an appropriated building that wasn't built for that is the Bethel Library. The center portion of this, the Greek Revival part that has the columns, was built as a private residence, and it was left. It was built in 1842, and it was left in 1914 by the family for Bethel to create its first library. And then the wings were added and largely expanded it in 2005. But this is a really good example of what most of the libraries prior to 1875 in Connecticut, in New England, and New England was the center of the library movement at that moment of time, that they were in appropriated spaces. They weren't in purpose-built buildings for libraries. They were in buildings that had been built for other things, and they had to be adapted. And there wasn't really a lot of thinking that had gone into them at that point. The trigger that set this in motion was that in the 1840s, two things happened. Public schools started the government started paying for schools for education. We started putting a priority on things, and libraries were seen as a way of continuing education beyond the 8th grade. And also technologically, the rotary press was introduced. Up until that point, books were very, very slow to be produced. Newspapers, anything printed was produced by 16th century technology, one page at a time. But the rotary press would allow speed up the production of books, and it dropped the cost of books. And in the 1850s, the Library of Congress was established, as well as the Boston Public Library, the first urban public library in the United States. And both things happened in the 1850s. A Library of Congress was to collect all books that were published in America and also all government publications. So the public education movement sort of creeps up very slowly through time. And it collides in the 1870s with the City Beautiful movement, which really begins with Olmsted's Central Park in New York. we were putting in parks, recreation spaces. They had originated out of common pasture for animals, but they weren't really pleasure grounds until Olmsted's Central Park was this large space that was aesthetically designed for visual pleasure. And that marks the beginning of the City Beautiful movement. The Merritt Parkway marks the end of it because the next road to come into Connecticut was anything but visually pleasing, I-95. In 1876, the American Library Association is formed. A bunch of librarians who were at the public libraries in big urban areas and academic libraries got together and they said, look, there is a science to library. We're collecting books, we're managing collections of books. We need to take a different approach to it. And they become a major voice in the way the modern library building is shaped. And then in 1893, in Chicago, on the 500th anniversary of the discovery of North America by Christopher Columbus, the World Columbian Exposition creates a new template for urban design, where buildings relate to one another. They're very formal, they're very ornamental, there's a sense of ensemble. And all those ideas come into play in the development of the new building type of the modern library. So on the left here, we have, we'll start the story with the Vatican, at the Vatican, and the Medici Library, which were two of the earliest libraries in the West. This is the Laurentian Library by Michelangelo on the left. And it was really designed very much like religious buildings were at the time, with a center aisle and then pews on the sides. And the books were stored in those pews. They were chained to the pews so they couldn't be stolen. They were mostly manuscripts. And that's how book collection or book storage was handled in the 16th century. The building actual shell didn't change that much as the first academic libraries appeared on the scene in the United States. And this is a Yale University's library, first library in New Haven. And it was basically just like a church with a center reading area in the middle. And then the side aisles were put over to book storage. And in those niches between the columns, there were like tall, really difficult to access shelves of books, shelving that was way beyond human reach. You had to go up on a ladder to do that. And to manage those book alcoves required a lot of people to keep retrieving books and putting them back up in some sort of organized system. These book alcove systems proved to be unexpandable. You couldn't, if your collection grew, and as it was growing because of the rotary press, you couldn't expand these buildings. They were so formal and rigid in their profile. So the new field of library science started to say, we need to build buildings that could be flexible, that could be expanded as the collections grew. And this weird photograph that got bent out of shape here on the right is one of the alcove book halls by the architect Henry Hobson Richardson, who really kind of pioneered the first small libraries in the United States. That's Richardson down at the lower right. He was a larger-than-life, colorful character born in Louisiana who made his practice in New York. He was the second American architect to be trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. So he came back with a lot of very sophisticated ideas of how buildings were planned. And this is a floor plan of Richardson's first library, the Wynn Memorial in Woburn, Massachusetts, from 1877. The room that's marked library on the right is that book alcove library that was compressed in the last slide. So it was the place where books were stored and managed. The collection was there. But what Richardson did was also mold the building in a kind of a less formal, rigid way to accommodate other activities. So The book collection was separate from storage, from where the books were actually read. And here he had two reading rooms separated by the librarian's desk, which was the place where books were distributed to the readers. There, the stacks themselves, the shelves were not accessible to the public in those days. And then the programs of some of these early libraries had auditoriums, picture galleries here, and a little museum building. And so Richardson was able to do that by breaking away from the symmetry of American architecture up to that point and making buildings asymmetrical to fit the building's uses. And this is what the building looked like on the outside. And Richardson also established the iconography of the late 19th century public library. He looked back to pre-Gothic France, Southern France in particular, and came up with a Romanesque. So the period between the fall of the Roman Empire and the Gothic revival in Europe, or the Gothic arrival in Europe, a round arch style with a lot of ornamental carving on it. And he created a whole iconography of these buildings. So in Fairfield County, we only have one building that's still standing. It's no longer a library from that Richardsonian period. It's not by Richardson, but it's basically the same concept internally as Richardson. So there was a big book hall in the original Danbury Public Library. It's now the Music Center in Danbury, right in the center of Danbury. The library function was located on the second floor here, and you can see that there's like a clear story roof at the very top of the building, which was a skylight that lit the book hall where the books were stored. And the reading rooms were in the front of the building, separate from the book storage. And like many of New England's first libraries, the Danbury Public Library was founded by what are considered today as benevolent native sons. They were basically men, for the most part, who had made a fortune, and then were the first generation of library philanthropists, and came back to their communities and gave as a gift to the community, based on the wealth that they had made elsewhere, a library. And the Danbury Library was a gift of the White family, who were hat makers, which was the primary industry in Danbury at the time. The Danbury Library, this is a real treat to just walk around this building. It's a very richly detailed. It's really of no specific historical style, but it uses details that are largely drawn from architecture in Florence. And so you have these round arches set within these very flat pointed arches, and that's a very typical Florentian detail. But the carving on this building is really quite exquisite. Now, these libraries with these big center alcove halls were not all that popular with the first generation of librarians. The American Library Association, founded in 1876, Justin Windsor, who was the librarian at Harvard University's Gore Library, basically said, the public wants books to read, not to look at. These early buildings with these alcove book halls, you could like look inside them, and it was like a jewel box presentation of the collection. So the philanthropists gave the money for the buildings and the books, and they wanted them set, and they wanted them to look very beautiful, but they were really difficult to manage. And William Frederick Poole, who was the head librarian at the Chicago Public Library, basically was a lot more indirect about it, said that the way that we handle books in libraries is absurd, extravagant, combustible, and inconvenient. And it was the library, the books were stored way up high where all the heat rose in the room, and it just degraded the paper that the books were printed on. So Poole was a very, very forceful critic of the early plans for the Library of Congress, which was going to be a big alcove book hall kind of arrangement. And his advocacy really shaped the building into much more of a modern library. Pequot is our first modern library in Fairfield County. It is the most sophisticated library in Connecticut of its time. It's one of the earliest libraries in the United States, in fact, to incorporate the early ideas of the American Library Association in its design. Outwardly, it looks very much like Richardson's libraries. It's Romanesque Revival on the outside. It's unlike the founding fathers of most philanthropic exercises. This library was founded by a woman, which was highly unusual because this was just not an arena of women philanthropy. In 1885, when Virginia Marquand Monroe came up with the idea that she wanted to build a library in Southport that was as free as the air to the patrons of the library. The family wealth that she was using had come out of the silver trade. She was the sole heir of her uncle, pictured on the left, Frederick Marquand, and she inherited his wealth. And he was not particularly interested in libraries, so she really departed from the pattern of his philanthropy in founding a library. He was far more interested in Christian institutions and chapels and things like that. And just some samples of some of the silver that they sold. Frederick's father had been apprenticed in Norwalk as a silversmith. And they made their wealth trading silver in the southern states and then setting up a very high-end store in New York City. Oh, I really apologize for this. I don't understand what's going on with the images here, but there's an elevation of it and just some details from the outside of the building. So in terms of the chronology and why this building is so important is instead of an alcove book hall, it just dispenses. The plan dispenses with those alcove book halls and introduces something that hadn't been done in small libraries up to that point. On the very far left is a floor plan by Poole, Mr. Poole, the Chicago librarian, who basically recommended building a space off to the side or to the back of the library that you could enlarge very easily and keep going outward so that you could build more stack space, more shelving space for your books. And Pequot in the original plan of Pequot, the area that shaded up and sort of towards the upper right-hand corner of the plan is the original library. And this was closed off to the public just like the book halls had been, but it wasn't a place where you could admire the books, so to speak. It was designed so all the shelves were at reachable height, so the librarians could put them back in the right place very easily and didn't have to get up on ladders. And it was built with tiered shelves that were prefabricated and put in. It's one of the early installations. And it proved its worth. So the library opens in 1893, and by 1898, their collection has grown so much that they need to expand the shelves. So they punch out through the back and they double the size of it with another gift from another local woman philanthropist. And so it is the first example of library science really in action at Pequot. And the stacks were really quite beautiful to themselves. They were meticulously restored in the 1980s. They're open to the public today. You can walk in there. And they had gilding on some of the trim. They're cast iron, and they terminated in a window by the Tiffany studio. So this was a really beautiful space, and it still is quite remarkable today. The figures on the windows are very unusual for this Tiffany studio. They figure two major figures in the development of the printing press and printing technology in the West. And these are just some of the details here of what the stack bookends look like. Remember, these were originally just seen by the librarians and opened to the public in the 1940s. And instead of this big monumental book hall, you had very nice reading rooms. Pequot reading rooms were originally separated by gender. And then by the early 20th century, they were designated by age. So there was an adult reading room and a children's reading room. And it's really quite a charming place to spend an afternoon tucking into books. It has been undergoing restoration. A lot of the original woodwork got painted at some point and was meticulously restored in the 1980s, as well as this mantelpiece in one of the reading rooms. And they're attached to it, part of its original program was a large auditorium that has got brilliant acoustics in it. It's a really beautiful space, quite wonderful to hear a piano concerto there or a concert. There are a number of other Richardsonian Romanesque type libraries but also they incorporate Poole's ideas of expansion and get away from Richardson's idea of how to collect books and store them and go to the more modern way. And Plum Memorial in Shelton is the next earliest example of this in the county of this type of library. You can see in the back, the front of the building is on the right facing the street, but in the back there's a little gable roof that sticks out. That is the original stack space, and that was enlarged at one point, and then a new addition was put on the other side of the building. This was the result of patronage of someone who never left the community. David Wells Plum was a local industrialist in Shelton, and he gave the money for it on condition that the town support the operation of it going ahead. And that was the first example of that arrangement in Fairfield County, which was the same requirement that Carnegie had later when he started funding libraries. He would only give to the construction of the building if the town would commit to supporting the library going forward. That was one of the failings of the early generation of philanthropy, is that there was no, the philanthropist would give the money for the building and then they'd have to figure out how to operate it. Towns in Connecticut, as you know, people don't like their taxes raised, even for something as popular as a library. So the Plum sort of broke new ground in Fairfield County, and it's really quite a beautiful library. This library loves this building. The board has taken excellent care of this library, and the reading rooms are really quite wonderful. With again, just like Pequot, with highly decorated mantelpieces in the reading rooms and stained glass elsewhere in there. And that's the new addition that's off to the right, which really was set back and very, very sensitively designed to work with the old part of the library. Stratford Library is another library that's in the Richardsonian mode and also built with an expandable stack at the rear. You can see that how it was expanded on the very far right of the photograph. Much later in its tenure. I think that went in the 1960s, and it was when they punched out to add more storage space. This was a gift of Birdseye Blakeman, who was a native of Stratford, who went to New York, became a major educational publisher, made his fortune, selling textbooks pretty much to schools. And he hired the architect who had just done Cornell Library, the Olin Library at Cornell. And so this is one of the few buildings that was designed by an architect from out of state. And it's really quite a beautiful, it's not the dark stone that Richardson preferred. It's a much lighter limestone from upstate New York, but it's still got that rugged Richardsonian character to it. And the reading room on the right is a very intimate room. It's now, there's been 2 additions to this building, and this is used for a similar, the original reading room is now used for a similar purpose that this room is being used for tonight for lectures. And just some examples of some of the carving and the quality of the stonework. The building was enlarged at first with a separate pavilion that was freestanding from it. So the grounds had 2 separate standing buildings that were connected in the back in the 1960s and 70s by a U forming a court shape. The building on the left was funded by another Stratford family, the Sterling family, that also paid for the construction of the Sterling Library at Yale. Oh, this is terrible. I don't really know why this is going on, but maybe it's because am I on an Apple here instead of a, yeah, Apple. I composed this on Microsoft, so I apologize for that. We move out of the Richardsonian phase and into the neoclassical period of architecture. Styles change after the World's Columbian Exposition. Washington, D.C. Today is predominantly a product of what happened with the City Beautiful movement after the World Columbian Exposition, that the vocabulary of all the buildings reverted to classicism again. And the two great works of library architecture of this period are Mckimita White's Boston Public Library, which is the second building built for the Boston Public Library. This replaced the original one that was built in the 1850s, and Creer and Hastings New York Public Library. Both of these are still very active today. Boston Public was added to with an addition by Philip Johnson in the 1970s that doubled its size. New York Public has never been enlarged outwardly, but it's been enlarged underneath Bryant Park for additional storage. Major works of architecture. And that comes out to Fairfield County as well, that new taste for classicism. And among the earliest of these is the Morris Memorial in Ridgefield, just up the road from us. And this is a very different break in architectural vocabulary from what Richardson was working with. It's also of a new scale of library too. Again, it goes back to become symmetrical again, so it has to fit the stack functions, the shelving functions, and the reading rooms into a symmetrical space. And it's a little less complicated in the program from the earlier libraries. There aren't auditoriums added onto this at this point in time. This is what it looks like today with a large addition that was put on in the last 15 years by Newman Architects of New Haven, and done with great sensitivity to the original, keeping a lot of the original character of the building in place with the addition, making the connection to the building very subtle, of the new to the old. The Colonial Revival by the turn of the century is seen as, instead of the big monumental marble temples that are going up in Washington, D.C., a more intimate, more domestic scale style of classicism is the Colonial Revival. And that's seen as very fitting for the New England landscape, and Connecticut in particular. And the Fairfield Memorial Library is the first example. It's by the same architect who did the Plum Library. So the architects were also changing. His name was Beardsley. He was a student he apprenticed with Henry Austin, New Haven's most prominent 19th century architect. And Beardsley starts looking at a number of details that were very important at the time that the colonies were settled. Now, buildings of this style were never built in Fairfield County at that time. We just didn't have the wealth here to do that. But this was what was being built in the Georgian period when the colonies were being established here. And the Georgian period was a period of great revival and an embrace of Italian Renaissance architecture, specifically of the architect Andrea Palladio, who is identified today by the window that's above the front entrance here, but it's also called Serliana, after Palladio's successor, the architect Serlio. But it really wasn't invented by Palladio, and it wasn't invented by Serlio. It's an ancient Roman form that goes back to classical antiquity. And but it was embraced by New England architects for libraries, and it was very closely associated largely because the main Renaissance library in Venice had a whole arcade of this window on it, a type of window. And this library has been largely renovated on the first floor, but the second floor spaces are really quite wonderful, and they're still intact from their original condition. There's a meeting room, again, serving this function on the second floor with a beautiful gentle barrel vault ceiling and a small little conference room off of it for smaller meetings on the second floor. And this building was also expanded numerous times, but most recently, again, by Newman Architects in 2005 to the part to the right. The Westport Public Library also uses a Palladian motif in the front of its portal as well. A very beautiful. This is no longer in use as a library. Westport built a new library across the road on it, and recently just completed a spectacular renovation of that library. That it's one of the most sophisticated libraries in Fairfield County right now. But this was where they started. This was a gift by Morris Ketchum Jessup, who was J.P. Morgan's business partner, and he was also the first president of the Museum of Natural History in New York. So he was building that building at the same time that he gives this gift, very monumental. This is probably the most monumental library built in Fairfield County during this period. The carving is very, very imperial Rome-like. It has a great street presence. It still really jumps out along the Post Road. It's right on the Post Road in downtown Westport. The Ferguson Library is the library that I grew up with in Stanford. And it was designed by a Stanford architect who had grown up and had gone to work for Mckimita and White, the architects of the Boston Public Library. And Swarwoot, who was the architect, likely worked on the Boston Public Library, although this is nothing like the Boston Public Library. It's a much smaller library named after John Day Ferguson, who left a small bequest to start the library. And like this library, the Ferguson started out in a private house in downtown Stamford prior to 1909, when it moved into its own purpose-built building. This building was very, very modern for its time. It was published in Scientific American as an example of how to integrate a stack system that could be accessed by the public into into a Colonial Revival building. So the photograph on the right shows the doors you come into at the front, and those stairs going up lead up into this tiered mezzanines of the stacks originally. The stairs are still there, but the stacks were removed in the 1980s. And the photograph on the left shows the stair going over to what was in view into what was originally the children's library. So this building was intentionally built with a reading room for children and a reading room for adults as well. And it's just a beautiful, you walk into the space, and this space has just been cleared out. For many years, this was cluttered with all sorts of oddball, stuff that they couldn't fit anywhere else in the building. And finally, just a few years ago, they just moved all that stuff out and really captured the sense of space in the library on the entrance. And this is a view into the stacks from as you come in the front door on the left. That's what you would have seen originally. And that's what we saw when we were kids originally. The stacks were taken out in the 1980s. And what the reading rooms, the two reading rooms look like. And that's basically the same room today. So it still has its architectural bones with different furniture in it. New Canaan's library has one of the most interesting backstories on it. New Canaan didn't have the wealth of most of the other towns that were on the coast. The hinterland was not the wealthy part of Fairfield County at that point. Most of the money was down there, and New Canaan didn't have someone who went away and made a lot of money and came back and gave a library to the town. So they had to raise the money themselves. And it was a huge effort. And the library was built at a moment in New Canaan's history when it was transitioning from, believe it or not, a dying industrial center. It was a center of leather working. The leather industrialists who made shoes really lobbied to get the train service to New Canaan, not to move people in and out. It wasn't a commuting town, but to move shoes out and move raw materials into New Canaan, because they were dependent on really bad roads down to the port of Stamford to get those things out. So, but by 1900, the railroad comes in the 1870s. By 1900, New Yorkers, especially Brooklynites, have discovered New Canaan and as a place you can get on a train in New York City and come all the way out and get into fresh air and find cheap real estate. And so there's this big influx of New Yorkers in the first decade of the 20th century. And they work together with the old timers. Now, this doesn't always go well in Connecticut communities when newcomers come in and start, mixing with old timers. But in New Canaan, they got together over this building. They all pulled together to get this building built. They did a huge community-wide fundraising, and they had a design competition for it that was limited to 6 architects who were living in New Canaan in 1911. No other Connecticut town had 6 architects living in there. And if you know, New Canaan today is very proud of its Harvard 5 heritage of the mid-century modern architects. But there were these architects were there a generation before the Harvard 5 and probably paved the way for the Harvard 5 to come in. So, we shrunk all the architects again too. Sorry, but the winning architect was the guy on the right, Alfred H. Taylor, who had never designed a library and had only designed banks primarily and a couple of residences. And he was up against most of his other competitors here. And this was a friendly competition among these 6 architects. Had designed, in fact, Austin Lord on the left had designed probably 20 libraries at that point. It was a blind competition. So the judges didn't know which of these 6 guys designed the building. And they picked the one that they liked the best. And they picked this really wonderful building from what we don't even know what the other 5 competitions were, because it was the tradition for the architects to take their drawings back so they could enter them into another competition at some point. We don't know what the other designs were, but it came up with a very, very interesting building. And so this is the original floor plan of the library. And you can see that it's really divided up into 5 primary spaces. On the lower left-hand corner were the stacks in that one space. Across the hallway at the bottom right was a meeting room that was shared by the library and the New Canaan Historical Society. In the upper left-hand corner was the adult reading room. In the upper right-hand corner was the children's reading room. And then the small section in the middle was the distribution center for the librarian's office, which was dead center on the entrance to the building. This was very similar to the way Carnegie libraries were laid out at the time. What Taylor did on the outside is very interesting. He took that iconic Palladian motif and he broke it up into 3 different presentations on the exterior facade. Overlooking the reading room, the meeting room, he did a very, very formal archway, a Palladian Surliana, to light that room. But down at the stack side, he broke it up the way that stacks were broken up in the back of the Boston Public Library and the back of the New York Public Library, with a number of narrow windows to fit the stacks between them. But it's still divided very much like a Palladian window. So he's making a reference to the other side on the building. And then looking back to that early period in Georgian England, he found a very, very famous elevation in a very famous architectural book of the garden elevation of Chiswick House, which was the home of Lord Burlingame, who was the Lord Burlington, who was the sort of the brain trust behind the early Georgian revival in Great Britain. And he takes that elevation and he puts it on the front of the building in a very, very rugged, primitive, you could say, colonial way that would only be in the colonies in the proportions. And he superimposes it onto the front of the library. So it's really quite a clever compositional feat that he performed. He knew, they all knew that the judge of the competition, there was a committee, the building committee, but they were being advised by an architect who was the director of composition at the Columbia School of Architecture. So they must have all been playing to his preferences. The interior right now, the only space that's really intact is the meeting room, the reading room. It was really carefully restored in the 1990s. And it terminates with, it has a very shallow barrel vault that terminates in these lunettes at the ends of the walls that were painted by a local muralist who had been a contractor just 5 years ago, and he was transitioning to becoming an artist. Now, the lunettes, the architectural services, and the competition, that was all contributed. This was all done in community spirit to getting this library done. And that's really unusual in Connecticut libraries as well. Oh, Andrew Carnegie got Appleized too here. So we'll talk a little bit about the Carnegie era of our libraries, because we didn't get a lot of funding for Carnegie libraries, but we have a couple of really beautiful ones. And then in Bridgeport, we have a number of really interesting ones. The South Norwalk Public Library is probably the best example of a Carnegie library in Fairfield County. And it has all the ingredients, and we've been hinting at with some of the other libraries. We're now symmetrical, classical vocabulary. And as I mentioned before, a precondition was that the city of South Norwalk and the town of Norwalk were two separate municipalities at the time. So they each got grants for their own public libraries. They're now incorporated within the same municipality. But both municipalities committed to funding the libraries going forward. And it's still very, very much intact today, with a large addition at the back, as most of the libraries have had. The brickwork on this building is something worthwhile taking a look at. It's a long tan brick called Roman brick. And when you set it on a curved surface, it kind of sits proud at the joints. So it creates this wonderful kind of woven texture into the building that's quite beautiful. And the Carnegie didn't require them, but really the Carnegie Foundation preferred having lanterns. The first floor of the library being up a flight of steps, which is really problematic for ADA today, and also having lanterns set at either side of the entryway as symbol of light and learning. But not all Carnegie libraries were in the classical vocabulary. This is one that's sort of in an early Germanic, Saxon, Middle English vocabulary, funded by Carnegie, but designed by the Audsley brothers, who were English. They migrated to the United States and set up practice. They were mostly known for their interiors and their residential work. This is probably the only library that they ever designed, but it's pretty much the same floor plan as the South Norwalk Library is too. And this building survives. The interior has been extensively remodeled, and it was extensively enlarged at the rear, but still reads as a really beautiful public library today. The Perrott Library in Old Greenwich is a wonderful integration of City Beautiful principles. It's contemporary with Binney Park, if you know downtown Old Greenwich. The Binney family that were the Crayola Crayon family. They gave a large parcel of swampy land to be drained and made into a pond. The architect who owned the land here basically designed the building and gave them the land for the library. He was D. Everett Wade. He was the architect of the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company in New York City. That was never completed. It was going to be the biggest skyscraper in the world when it was under construction in 1928. It was going to be higher than the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building, but they never finished it. They never topped it off. It was a very Gothic building. And he did a very kind of Southern, this library has a Southern feel. It's a much more formal Colonial Revival than the other earlier Colonial Revival buildings. It's got a beautiful, you enter a flight of stairs and come into this beautiful rotunda inside the library. And over on the left is a children's wing that was added using some of the same vocabulary, certainly the same arches and things in the I think it's 2010s is when that was added. So we've been talking about like small time village libraries up to this point, but the Bridgeport system was heavily funded by Carnegie in terms of the branch libraries, and is really the first example in Fairfield County of a big city library system, in that it was mostly dependent on branch libraries, all serviced by a central library building. So the library was started in 1883 with, Bridgeport really wasn't much of a place until the Civil War, and it really, the economy took off, and it rapidly became the biggest city in Connecticut in the late 19th century. So the first building that is used as a library is essentially a warehouse loft of a merchant that is given by the daughter of the merchant on her death to be used in perpetuity as the library. It's the building on the right here, the far right, that says Burroughs Public Library on it, named for the family. And again, it was an appropriated building. It wasn't really a good, the best choice for a library, but it worked for a number of years because they didn't have anything else, and they built up an enormous collection there. But what they really, Bridgeport pioneered in Connecticut was a branch library system. So they had the storage of the collection in that building, and they had delivery boys on bicycles or motorbikes go around to the neighborhoods to deliver books from the collection that people wanted to read. So the branch libraries didn't store a lot of books. They had some resident reference books, but if you wanted like the latest novel, you had to like put in your order and wait a day till it came to your branch library. This is one of the typical branch libraries. This was funded by a Carnegie grant. And you can see that all it is really 2 reading rooms, a desk, and then an area for reference books in the plan. There's no need for a stack here because nothing gets really stored here. So these are really much smaller buildings than any of the other buildings we've been looking at. And there was a whole network of them built throughout the city in the different neighborhoods, east, west, north, and south. Probably the finest one was the West Branch over near the Fairfield line. And it became known as the Sanborn Branch after the librarian. It was named for the librarian who had created the library system in the area. Sorry about the squished plan, but basically it faced a park, and it was really quite beautifully sited, very much like the old Greenwich Library. It was a very formal building, very similar inside to the Ferguson Library. And sadly, this building was sold outside of the city to a private owner, and it was demolished in 2018. A real shame, because this is the kind of building you don't want to lose in your community. So after the branch network is set up, Bridgeport builds a new main library. They get rid of the old warehouse building and build a new library that, if you look at it, it is based on classical precedent, and it's based on basically a Roman Italian Renaissance palazzo, but it's a very, very spare. Now we're getting into the 1920s and the 30s, and classicism is getting streamlined. We're also getting into the period where the Merritt Parkway is being designed, and there are a lot of classical bridges on the Parkway, but they don't look like traditional, the kind of classicism we've been seeing. They're very, very streamlined. So this building is very similar to the Parkway in many respects. It's like the earlier libraries in that the stacks have these linear windows in the back. In fact, it looks like an industrial building in the back side of it. And the front is, unlike the Carnegie buildings, you enter at grade, but when you're inside, you have to go up. There was an elevator built with this building at the time. And the principal floor was on the second floor of the Bridgeport Library, and still is. And so that was the fanciest moment in the Bridgeport Library is the entry hall when you walk in, and there's this beautiful curving stair similar to the Perot Library that we just saw. But on the inside, it's not detailed with any classical ornament. It's very, very, it's poured concrete ribs that carry the floor system. They're very graceful. It's not really a barrel vaulted flat ceiling anymore. The structural system is exposed. It's a very modern library in many ways. And it still functions almost identically to the way it was laid out originally. Its stack system was in the back, perpendicular to those windows so that you could get light into it. And again, everything was reachable at human height, and a massive card catalog system. So we're going to jump ahead to a number of libraries that probably will be considered historic. In fact, the Weston Public Library is protected under the Weston's Historic Preservation Ordinance, even though it's not anything like the historic libraries we had. There was a period where there weren't many new libraries being built until the 60s and the 70s. So we'll look at just a few of those, and then I'll take some questions if you have any. The Weston Public Library, because like the Bridgeport Library, which was divided into different disciplines, unlike the adult and the children reading room, the reading room, there were more reading rooms for different functions. There was a science and technology room, there was a reference room, there was a high school student room that was separated from the children's room and from the adult room. I guess they had a tiered issue there. The Weston Library was conceived as a series of mid-century modern pavilions that used the native stone of New England that many of the modernists in Fairfield County used, but with a lot of glass, minimal wall surfaces. And it's really quite a beautiful complex of buildings. By Fairfield County's least recognized, but one of the best mid-century modern architects, Joseph Salerno. He did a lot of residences in Wilton and Weston. He also did the Rowayton unit, the Rowayton Church, the Congregational Church in Rowayton that's shaped like a nautilus. It's quite a beautiful building. And this is one of his other major public buildings. And it's just it's a treat to just walk around this building because the setting is so beautiful too in the complex that it's in. The Wilton Library is another really good example of a mid-century modern library by one of New Canaan's Harvard Five. Elliot Noyes, who again got shrunk up in the right-hand side, sorry, was the one that designed. He was an industrial designer and an architect who designed the IBM Selectric typewriter. His house was in New Canaan. It uses a very similar vocabulary. He was known for using very, very expansive plain surfaces of wall. And this building that's now a bank was the original Wilton Library building, built in 1975. But a new building was built across the parking lot and enlarged, and this is what it was enlarged to, using the same architectural vocabulary of expansive white planar surfaces that Noyes had used on his original library. Much larger and much more complex program. This is a look down on the architectural model that the building was built from. And it created one of the most wonderful spaces of any libraries in Fairfield County. That's Dave Brubeck's piano, that the whole wall opens up and people can gather in an interior courtyard and listen to really wonderful music. And I just want to end on the Greenwich Library to give a shout out to the late Cesar Pelli, an Argentinian born architect who did the last addition to the Greenwich Library. The library started much earlier, but that building is lost, so I didn't include it in the tour today. It was a beautiful little jewel box-like building on Greenwich Avenue. But they outgrew that and moved up and took over the Franklin Simon store. It was a sort of a small local department store on the Post Road on Putnam Avenue, down in the lower left-hand corner. They moved up there in 1961, did an adaptive use of that building, which is one of the last appropriations of a building like the Mark Twain Library. And then Sherwood Mills and Smith, next to its right, did a brutalist addition for an auditorium in the 1970s and reworked it in the 1980s. And then Pelli came in 1999 and put on an addition that terminated in this kind of wedge-shaped object. It's called the Jewel, and it is like a jewel. It's a very disorienting room to be in because there are no. It's fish-shaped. It's sort of two lozenge-shaped walls like this coming together with a lot of windows in it. It's quite a lovely wooden paneled building, and it kind of brings us back to the beginning of the libraries when they really had a sense of just doing things for beauty, and that's the interior of it there. So with that, I think we are. I just want to mention a book that I don't know if you have it in your collection here, but if you're interested in American libraries, Kenneth Breisch, an architectural historian, has done a wonderful book on the architecture of libraries. And if you want to know the Merritt better, the Conservancy publishes a guide to the Merritt Parkway that has all the exits that I have listed on the slides here, numbered and shown. And if you'd like a free copy of it, I'd be happy to mail you one. So just contact me by email and put it in order. And that's it.